Hi everyone, my name is Shanelle Fiaalii and I'm a Wurundjeri woman from Cape York Peninsula in Australia. I come from the Warren family. My father's name was Geoffrey Thomas Warren. My grandmother, Topsy, was a member of the Stolen Generation. My grandfather, Churchill, also known as Tom Warren, was born on country and he lived a traditional life until he was forcibly removed along with the rest of our people. His mother, Moiri, is our apical ancestor. I'd like to acknowledge that I am on Turrbal in Yagara country, a place where education has always been important and where sovereignty has never been ceded. I'm sure we've all heard the depictions of Indigenous people as seen by the colonisers, depictions of savages who needed to be civilised, barbarians with limited intellect, those who were superstitious and ignorant. In Australia, missionaries perpetuated these views. Typical church-operated missions were cruel places where punishments ranged from jail time and flogging to public shaming, shaved heads and solitary confinement. Ironically, many who lived on a mission remained members of the church that operated it, despite the treatment that they received. So as a teacher, I found myself within a Christian school system deeply shaped by colonial and missionary constructs. I taught English, ironically, the language of the colonisers who stripped my grandparents of their own languages. The schools that I taught in were not culturally safe spaces, and despite teachers eventually receiving cultural awareness training, days like dress up as an early settler day continued without a second thought, and if challenged, there was always resistance. Reconciliation Week was added to the school calendar, but it became quite tokenistic. And even today, the colonial legacy remains, and there is a significant lack of understanding regarding First Nations issues. My experience in this school system informed my research, which was conducted with English teachers in a Christian school to determine how they engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and what the effects of using a framework based on country, culture and community had on their engagement and their implementation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. The Australian Curriculum English expects all students up to Year 10 to examine and engage with texts by First Nations authors. Teachers have avoided this in the past by choosing texts that include First Nations characters but are written by non-Indigenous authors. One of the participants confirmed this, saying, "A lot of the texts that we look at for Indigenous perspectives aren't written by Indigenous Australians, so what's the point?" Chelsea Wadigo, in her book Another Day in the Colony, states that non-Indigenous authors tend to construct Indigenous characters as the problem and non-Indigenous characters as the solution. An example of this can be seen in Jasper Jones by Craig Silvey, which is often referred to as Australia's own version of To Kill a Mockingbird. Jasper, the teenage Aboriginal outcast, is shown wearing dirty, ill-fitting clothing, attending school solely to play football, and carrying a reputation as, quote, a thief, a liar, a thug, a truant, lazy and unreliable, the rotten model that parents hold aloft as a warning. At the end of the book, Jasper ends up leaving town alone because, as Wadigo says, there never is a happy ever after for the Aborigines in literature. Two other popular texts in English classrooms include Nambury by Jackie French and The Secret River by Kate Granville. But as Lean in 2016 states, such persistent use of settler literature allows for the cultural transmission of settler narratives and values, and in doing so overwrites Aboriginal history and experience. Both authors have admitted that they use stereotype, cliché, and guesswork in their depiction of Aboriginal characters because they are, quote, simply too far away to understand people whose reasons for doing things and customs were so different from ours. So in saying this, the authors admit to not even considering that knowledge has been passed down through the generations, and that they could have approached people today to find out information. First Nations authors are starting to reclaim traditional languages in their novels. As an act of sovereignty, the titles of Wiradjuri author Anita Heiss's novels, Bila Yaradungalungdare and Diraya Wada, are written in the Wiradjuri language, and she uses this language throughout the text as part of the narrative and dialogue. The Yield, a book by Tara June Winch, features the main character compiling a Wiradjuri dictionary of significant words. Winch says that there was a systematic suppression and attempted extinction of our first languages, and that this is part of intergenerational trauma that must be undone through language work, connecting with culture and country through claiming our own space and untying our tongues. The Yield is becoming more popular as a class text, and this raises the complexity of non-Indigenous educators teaching a text by a First Nations author without a meaningful understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing, being, and doing, and what their connection to culture and country actually means. These are intangible aspects of culture which cannot simply be taught, they need to be experienced. So for my research, it was imperative that I help English teachers experience country, culture and community in a tactile way, and therefore I used the Country, Community and Indigenous Research Framework by Babongi Harris, Hrumek and O'Brien as the foundation of my research. This framework is centred on relationships, positioning research as a collaborative effort with country as the foundation and community as the guide. Sorry, I'm just going to click on because that is out of order. I adopted the Country, Culture and Indigenous Research Framework to ascertain the importance of teachers connecting to country through an on-country experience with a traditional custodian, thus developing a meaningful awareness of ways of knowing, being and doing, and translating this into their teaching of First Nations texts. My participants included 10 English teachers. The teachers and the majority of students at the school are non-Indigenous, allowing me to investigate the attitudes of non-Indigenous teachers to teaching texts by Indigenous authors in their largely non-Indigenous classes. There was also an elder who had connections to the school and could lead the on-country experience. Data collection methods included yarning circles, written reflections, and engaging in personal storytelling. And one yarning circle was also held with school leaders. Although participants were non-Indigenous, it was important, due to the nature of the research topic, to expose them to these Indigenous methodologies. Reflexive thematic analysis was used to analyse the data because reflection and reflexivity are important extensions of an Indigenous research paradigm. And Nikki Moody's Decolonising Race Theory provided the theoretical foundation for the study, as it challenges deficit-based narratives and shifts Indigenous education beyond colonial constructs of race. My findings indicate that religious constraints do impede teachers from embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. Teachers in Christian schools are afraid of teaching about beliefs that are different to their own. Institutional attitudes also result in the denominational worldview taking priority over the demands of the curriculum. This goes hand in hand with the theme of tokenism, where a tick box approach to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives is seen. While they're checked off on compliance documents, this is not transferred into classroom practice. School leaders are eliminating collaboration with the local community or elder because they fail to budget accordingly, with the principal even calling for elders to work for free. And the wider school system lacks a project officer for Indigenous education, although other priority areas in the system do have a project officer. There's also a need for First Nations staff members to work within the schools, which falls back on the denominational university feeding the schools. Before the on-country experience, it was found that text choices perpetuate the notion that non-Christian views are less valuable than Christian views, with participants wanting a list of texts that suit their denominational ethos. The participants practice excluded texts by First Nations authors or diluted content to avoid perceived theological conflict. Teachers often defaulted to poetry or social justice themes to address Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and to, quote, shy away from controversy. This reflects Moody's logic of elimination, where Indigenous knowledges are marginalised to maintain the dominance of settler colonial worldviews. Although using a framework based on country, culture, and community deepened participants' understanding of local First Nations culture, it was evident that the teachers need support to ascertain how to transfer the knowledge gained on country into their classroom practice. They were still calling for help with choosing appropriate texts for their school ethos, saying, I need a bit more training and skill on how to select meaningful texts that are age appropriate and within our school context and ethos as well. And I would love to find a greater range of accurate and informative resources, including recommended Indigenous texts that we could study within a denominational school. However, calls for such a list reflect colonial thinking, in which texts are evaluated based on the denomination's religious beliefs rather than on the merit of the author's craftsmanship. It contrasts with culturally responsive pedagogy and reflects an assimilationist approach to teaching that prioritises preparing students to conform to dominant structures. The school leaders emphasised embedding Christianity into the curriculum as a higher priority than embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, with one participant saying, as a Christian school, we've got curriculum and we're trying to embed Christianity into it. And the participants wanted to appease white guilt, with one participant stating, I intend to showcase texts which keep these stories alive. However, I intend to do so without placing the European arrival always in conflict with the Indigenous one. As a Christian teacher, I feel it is important to do so without alienating and condemning possible audiences to white guilt, as it continues to create division. After the on-country experience, the head of department even bought a class set of books for Year 7, which was set in England in the 18th century, demonstrating that even though she verbally made a commitment to change, it was just too hard to think about choosing texts by First Nations authors that may suit the institutional demands. One participant reflected on a social yarn where I talked with her informally about how an understanding of country helps English teachers better understand novels by First Nations authors. She stated that, paraphrasing, one thing I struggle with whenever I do any sort of immersive experience like this is that I learn things, but in terms of practically transferring that into a classroom, that's where I struggle because I feel like I know more, but I don't feel more equipped to implement. So in response to these findings, I developed the Country to Curriculum framework, a framework which supports teachers to connect with community and culture through country, and then to integrate these insights into curriculum and pedagogy. There are already established pedagogical frameworks such as 8 Ways and Both Ways. 8 Ways highlights the importance of connection to country, culture, and community, but the training is theoretical. It's a localised framework and it's intended for teachers to use as a basis for developing their own frameworks in conjunction with their local community. Both Ways works well as a framework for teachers to support First Nations students' self-determination and to privilege First Nations knowledges and languages, but because its main purpose is to enable non-Indigenous teachers and Aboriginal students and communities to come to a common understanding, it does stop short of unpacking the colonial curriculum currently in place, and it is really an unsuitable framework for teachers in mainstream schools. So adapted from the Country, Community and Indigenous Research Framework, the Country to Curriculum Framework starts with the on-country experience with the elder, but I've extended this to support teachers back at school. After walking on country, the teachers participate in a yarning circle facilitated by a First Nations educator, where they debrief their experiences and discuss what they've learned and how they can apply their learning to the curriculum. This is held at school to remind teachers that their school is built on country and to reflect on the significance of this. It's also recommended that the school leadership team participates because without school leadership personnel understanding the importance of country and taking leadership in the area of Indigenous education, the teachers will not have the support they need to make changes. Following the on-country experience in the yarning circle, teachers engage in critical self-reflection, which helps them to acknowledge their implicit biases. The framework relies on school systems understanding the importance of employing a First Nations project officer or at least on-site educators available to work with the teachers through the process of connecting the knowledge they gained through the on-country experience with their curriculum and pedagogical choices, including their perceived barriers to denominational beliefs. One of the school leaders agreed, saying that if you don't have someone who's driving it all the time and reminding us, I don't know, personally, I sometimes forget. Forgetting about embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives demonstrates that First Nations students have been assimilated into these schools' cultures, thus devaluing them and what is important to them. Having First Nations voices within the schools and the wider school system is an important step towards reconciliation, a concept that's important to Christians in general and to teachers who are mandated to be agents of reconciliation. The findings of this study also highlight the significant influence of initial teacher education on teachers' capacity to embed Indigenous perspectives in curriculum and pedagogy. Participants who attended the denominational university that feeds teachers into these schools reported superficial exposure to Indigenous education. The unit was described as lacking depth and operating with deficit discourses. Such representations reflect the internalisation of colonial narratives and the reproduction of settler logics within teacher education. So while this research focuses on Australian Christian schools, its principles apply globally. Faith-based education systems worldwide grapple with colonial legacies and religious tensions. The country-to-curriculum framework offers a pathway for educators to engage respectfully with Indigenous knowledges, fostering reconciliation and equity. This study was important to me because English missionaries took away my father's and grandparents' voices, and it's time to reclaim our voices in the English classroom. I hope that in the future, my children's children will have a very different experience in their schooling. Thank you.